Tim and Marilyn and Judy. Good evening, church. Good evening. Or the part of the church that's in here anyway. Glad you're here tonight. We are starting a new series tonight. We'll see how long it lasts. Kind of depends on our discussion and how long it takes to get through the materials, but we're back to creation. We started in the book of Genesis about a year and a half ago, I think it was, and at that time we spent a lot of time in Genesis chapter 1 talking about some of these issues, but on February the 4th, a debate has kind of stirred all this back up again, as it does from time to time, and I thought it would be a good opportunity for us to discuss some of these issues once more. So our text this time, though, is going to be taken not from Genesis, but from Hebrews. If you would get your New Testament out, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Creation is not just an issue in the book of Genesis. It is an issue throughout the Bible. It's mentioned in the Psalms. It's mentioned in Job. In fact, some of the most powerful images about creation are in the book of Job. Creation is brought up in the New Testament, in the early parts of Romans, in this part of Hebrews, and so it is an important teaching about Scripture. Hebrews chapter 11 is a wonderful chapter. It's about faith, and there's a lot of faith involved in whatever you believe about creation, because none of us were there. But Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 says, "This is faith." So it starts out with a definition of faith. It's the substance of things hoped for, is the first thing that the writer of Hebrews gives us. Then he says it's the proof of matters not seen. The substance of things hoped for, the proof of matters not seen. Hope, by the way, in the Bible is not like English. Our English word hope is, gee, I hope that happens. In the New Testament, when it uses the word hope, elpizo, it means I'm banking on this thing happening. I'm building my life on this particular thing being true. And then he says, the third part is that, he goes on to verse 2 and he says, "For by this the ancients were commended." So in other words, their faith brought them commendation, and that commendation came from the Lord, came from God. And then in verse 3, most applicable to what we're talking about, it says, "By faith we understand." A lot of people today would think that those two words don't go together. A lot of people think that faith is something that transcends understanding, or something that is beneath intellectual understanding. It's in a completely different category. That's not what the Bible teaches. That's not what the New Testament teaches. The New Testament says that faith and understanding are integrated, that they work together. And faith is not a leap into something that doesn't make sense or we don't understand. Faith is what enables us to understand a lot of things. So he goes in verse 3 again, he says, "By faith we understand that something was created by the Word of God." And what was created by the Word of God here in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3, you're going to be surprised to find out about. I'll keep that as a little tag. I'll just hang that out there and let you wait for it. I know what your translations say, the world was made there, and it's possible, but I'm going to suggest to you that that is not the best way to render the word that was there. And then he finishes up this section by saying that not from things that appear, the things that we see have come about. Not from the things that appear, but the things that we see have come about. So on February the 4th, these two men, Bill Nye the Science Guy, anybody know who he is? Really animated, interesting looking man, for one thing. Watched his face for a long time this week going through this debate. The debate was 2.5 hours if you just sit and listen to it from beginning to end. And I didn't do that. I listened to parts of it over and over and over again. So I looked at Bill Nye's mug a lot and Ken Ham's mug a lot too. And Bill Nye's just a real interesting looking guy. And to set all of that off, he wears a big bow tie and he's real animated. He's used to being in front of a camera. He's done a lot of TV and so forth. And Ken Ham, I guess if Bill Nye's the science guy, then Ken Ham is the creation guy. But he's the CEO or co-founder of Answers in Genesis. They have a wonderful website with tons of information on it. He does spots on the radio that I always enjoy listening to. He too is a scientist, but he's a young Earth creationist. He believes that the Earth is no older than about 6,000 years, and he bases that on the Bible, and he defends it both biblically and scientifically. And so that was where a lot of the collision came between Nye and Ham. They met at Ken Ham's Answers in Genesis in Kentucky, which is a real nice facility. The moderator was Tom Foreman of CNN, did a good job. The debate was very civil. They got along well. It all went really well. It was watched online by about 3 million people. There's a lot of interest in this subject. 3 million people, plus an auditorium full, and 70 people from the media showed up. And a lot of articles have been written about the debate since then. And the debate was based on this question. This was the question that they were both answering. Is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era? Is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era? Ham went first, and his contention, which he developed in the debate, was, first of all, that the word science. By the way, did any of you see the debate? People on the staff in the church. Have any of you seen Bill Nye before? The young people up front and some of the not so young people.
Oh.
Hey, I'm middle-aged now. So
I know.
You wouldn't say that.
I didn't use the O word, okay? Don't throw anything at me. I'm displaying my white hair nowadays too, okay? Have any of you heard Ken Ham, any of his stuff that he's done? Kathleen, Tim, okay. Justin did it all. Ken Ham said that the word science has been hijacked by naturalists to impose atheism. That the creation and evolution debate is really a conflict between two philosophical worldviews based on two completely different accounts of origins or historical science beliefs. And then he said creation is the only viable model of historical science confirmed by observational science. Now, he's using a word there that really irritated Nye, but he based his whole argument on it. He said that there's two kinds of science. There's observational science and there's historical science. Observational science is the science that we can do now, the things that we see. It's the evidence of the natural world that is presented to us during our lifetime. Historical science, according to Ken Ham, is any kind of postulation that we make about the past. And Nye vehemently came back and said that scientists don't make such a distinction. There's just science. He used the example of CSI. Anybody ever seen CSI on TV? He said in CSI they don't make a distinction between historical science and observational science. They go in, observe science, and they make their conclusions, base their conclusions on what they see about what has happened in the past. I think they're probably both right for different reasons, but this distinction held all the way through the debate. It was one of the things that they fought about. One of the big things that they talked about was the flood. And if you're not familiar with Ken Ham and young creationists, their contention is that the flood was such a catastrophic event in the world that it created the evidence, all of the evidence that we see today in the geological record. All of those things were made as a result of the catastrophe of this water that covered the earth. And Nye would say, no, the evidence is very clear that these things were, these sediments, these layers, all of that was put there over long, long periods of time. It's pretty much, that was the debate right there in in one statement. Nye also, though, said there's billions of religious people who do not accept Ken Ham's model. And he kept coming back on that. By that he means that the earth is only 6,000 years old. And then he did something that I thought was quite interesting, and this was by design as well, and because he continued to come back and say that he is concerned that the United States of America, now listen to this and tell me what you would say to Bill Nye. He's concerned that the United States of America will fall behind technologically as a world leader in innovation and different scientific, especially technology, will fall behind if we teach kids about creation. What do you think about that? What would you say to that?
Hasn't affected it so far.
Hasn't affected it so far.
The leaders in technology.
There's a lot of believers in technology. How many scientists in the last 1,000 years were atheists? Not many. There may be a lot today, but most of what has been discovered by humanity has been discovered by people who believe in God. I don't know what they believed about the age of the earth, but they believed in God. They believed that God created the earth. And what Ham did next is he introduced a lot of young earth creationists who are inventors, professors, people who are published, engineers, and so forth. Obviously, they're decidedly in the minority in the scientific community, but his point was that they exist. They're people who are making, they're coming up with technologies, and they're advancing science, and they believe the same way that he did. And he also pointed out something that I think is important, that many of them are afraid to speak out. Why are they afraid to speak out?
Lose their money.
Scientific community has kind of reached a point where I use a popular term nowadays, they like to bully people who don't believe the same way that they do. Science is supposed to be about inquiry and asking questions and testing the existing model and so forth, but there's one group that can't test the existing model, and particularly that's people who believe in intelligent design. We'll talk more about that. But Ham also rightly pointed out that science must assume the laws of logic, the law of non-contradiction. If A is not B, then B is not A. There's a logic to the universe that is necessary for exploration of the universe. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. There's a uniformity of nature. He kept pointing out that we cannot observe the past directly, and so whatever we observe about the past is something that we have to guess about. We have to base it on what we observe in the present. Then he asked Bill Nye, can you name one piece of technology that could only have been developed starting with a belief in molecules to man evolution? That's one of his favorite terms. Molecules to man evolution is his reference to macroevolution, the idea that every piece of life on Earth, first of all, has a common ancestor, and that common ancestor came from somehow just atoms and molecules putting themselves together in some way to create the first biological life form. So he pointed out that both sides have evidence, but that they're doing different things with the same evidence. And he claimed that he was going to give some examples of predictability from the Bible, that you can predict certain things from the Bible. And this is something that Nye continued to come back with also. Now, Nye came, they started out with two 30-minute presentations, and in Nye's presentation, he used what was probably some of the most compelling evidence that he has for the age of the earth. He started out by pointing out that hollow drill bits are used to go down into ice glaciers and bring up cylinders from those ice glaciers to count the layers in the glaciers. And that sometimes there have been counted as many as 680,000 layers of ice And in those layers are tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere that can be analyzed. His contention is that those layers represent seasons. Each layer is an annual season. And so to him, that is prima facie evidence right there that the earth has to be at least 680,000 years old so that those layers could be laid down in each season. And so he looked at Ken Ham and he said 4,000 years, that would mean that there were 170 winter-summer cycles for every year. 170, and the math, of course, I'll take his word for the math. If that's true, if the earth is 680,000 years old, or if the earth is only 4,000 years old, and there's 680,000 layers, and those layers are put down once a year, or by one season, then you would have to have multiple seasons in 1 year. Then he pointed out that in California there are enormous stands of bristlecone pines, some over 6,000 years old, some 6,800 years old. How does he know that, by the way? The rings on the trees. And how do rings on the trees work? How long does it take a tree to put a ring on? It takes about a year to put a ring on a tree. So you can cut a tree down and count the rings on it. Jackie, you tell me if I'm wrong about this. And that tells you how old the tree is, right? And then he pointed out that there's a tree in Sweden, a famous tree named Tico. Jackie, have you ever heard of this tree? Tico. Tico is 9,550 years old. Based on, I guess, did they cut Tico down? I don't know how they know that until they cut it down. But I'll take their word for it. And so he asked Ham, how can Tico be 9,550 years old if the world is only 4,000 years old? Now, the reason that he's asking Ham, Ham says the world is 6,000 years old. Why is he saying 4,000? What happened 4,000 years ago, according to Ham?
Flood.
Noah's flood. And he says if the world was underwater for a year, what would happen to all the trees?
It'd rot.
They would die. And so, according to Ham's model, there can't be a tree older than 4,000 years old. That's why he's bringing all of this up. He's saying, well, how do you account for a tree that's over 6,000 years? How do you account for a tree that's 9,000 years old? How do you account for layers that would take 680,000 years to build up? And then he talked about humanoid skulls found all around the world. And he said some other things too. If you're really, really interested in them, you can watch the debate yourself. I thought that those were probably the most compelling things that Nye said about the age of the earth, for me personally, but I'm not a scientist. Others might be more impressed with other things. Now, what Nye and others are saying is that the earth is, does anybody know what science, how old science dates the earth, by the way? No? 4.5 billion years. 4.5 billion years is the current idea. Those things change. And the universe is supposed to be 13.5 billion years old. 13.7 billion years. What happened 13.7 billion years ago, by the way, according to the scientific model?
The Big Bang.
The Big Bang, right. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but then what Nye did is he pointed out that there's no place in Kentucky to get a certain particular degree in nuclear medicine. I didn't catch what he said. He keeps bringing this up over and over again. What is his point in bringing that up? Here in the great state of Kentucky, did you know that there's no place, he said, to get a degree in nuclear medicine?
The effect of that place being there, perhaps?
He's really insulting the people of Kentucky, is what he's doing.
That's what I mean, don't have to.
Trying to do it in kind of a nice way. But he's saying, you backward, uneducated, Neanderthal creation-believing Kentuckians are falling behind in science. Your universities don't even have a degree in nuclear medicine. And then he went on and talked about how if somebody needs that, if they're having a heart problem or whatever, what are you going to do about it? So he's got a charge going throughout this debate where he's saying that if we believe in creationism, then we can't be scientists. We can't advance technology. We can't understand what's going on in the world. And so there's really 2 or 3 different debates going on at the same time. And Ham keeps coming back on this one and pointing out the people who are in science now, who are young earth creationists, who are published, who have come up with inventions, and so forth. And now Ham comes back and he starts to bring up the theological problem with an old earth model. Let's think about this for a minute. If you believe that the earth is billions of years old, is there a problem with what the Bible says, or a potential problem with what the Bible says theologically? Does anybody know of one? One of the things that people will bring up is that if the model is right, the world's billions of years old, and there's been all these creatures live for millions of years, then all those creatures lived and died. And it sounds like it's saying in Genesis chapter 1, what about death? That death entered the world as a result of Adam and Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden, right? And so there's a theological rub there that young earth creationists will always bring up and say, how could all these creatures have died when there was no death in the world, according to the Bible, if that's what the Bible is saying? They'll also, and Kim Ham believes that, Kim Ham also believes that before the flood, all people ate only what?
Eating vegetables.
They were vegetarian. And so there's indication that it seems to be clear from the fossil record, according to the old earth scientists, that there were carnivorous beings on the earth prior to humanity. So they got a little funny here. He said, I give you the lion's teeth, and I said, you give me verses translated into English over 30 centuries. Now I continue to make pokes at the Bible. It didn't sound like, from what he said, that he knew much about the Bible. He brought up the telephone game, and this is what a lot of people will say, how can you believe that the Bible is true? When you play the telephone game, you tell somebody something, you go around the circle, it has changed, just going around that circle. How can you believe the Bible hasn't changed when it's been copied over years and years? Well, first of all, that's a bad analogy. It's a bad comparison. Because the Bible wasn't the telephone game. It wasn't just spoken into people's ears. It was written down and it was copied. And it was written down and copied by people who believed with all of their heart that it was the Word of God. They weren't just copying some menu to give to the lady down the street. They were copying the words of God. They were incredibly careful with that. If they made a mistake in a manuscript, they took it out and buried it in the ground because it was still holy, but they couldn't use it. And they came back and started all over again. Plus, Nye either doesn't know about or doesn't want to talk about the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrate the accuracy of the transmission of the Bible. We've talked about that in here before. If you're interested in that, you can get another Bible study where we've talked about that and listen to it. So I won't go into all the details, but he probably doesn't know as much about the Bible as he should. But then Nye comes back and he asks, well, what about all those fish that died before Adam and Eve sinned? Were they sinners? So he begins to kind of poke fun a little bit at Ham. And Ham comes back and he basically answers the tree rings and the layers in the ice with this: we didn't see the tree rings form. We didn't see the ice laid down. And he believes that the catastrophe of the flood is sufficient to explain the layers of ice. I don't know about the rings on the trees. He would just say, we didn't see it happen. Well, let me ask you, what do you think about that? If the world is only 6,000 years old and there's a tree that has 9,000 rings in it, What should we think about that? Anybody? Jackie? You think they miscounted?
Probably certain trees grow off the ring.
Certain trees may put a ring on more than a ring on a year.
God's in control of everything.
God's in control. He makes it happen. Anybody else? It's an interesting question. It's an interesting question. One of the things that Nye wants to talk about too is the carbon dating, radiocarbon dating. Y'all understand how that works, and that's used to date the Earth. And Ham says that, once again, Ham continues to come back to this distinction between historical science and observational science. And he said that we weren't there to know for sure that the laws of, he never said this out loud, but this is what he's implying. We weren't there to observe the laws of nature to say that they're exactly the same as they are today as they were back then. Well, Nye's going to have a problem with that. As a scientist, he has to believe what about the laws of nature? That they're consistent. He has to. Everything that he does is based on that. And so if the decay in this radiocarbon dating happens at a certain rate today, then he's bound to believe, unless there's some other evidence that has happened at that same rate all the way back 13.7 billion years to the Big Bang, when all of these laws came into effect. And so that's what his belief is based on. Kathleen?
Go back to the tree rings. But the growth season has to do with the tree rings too. I mean, if it's a dry summer, it may not grow as
Growth season might be different and affect the tree, right? Okay? So, and if you're fascinated by this, you can go on Ken Ham's website and read it. Ham didn't really deal with that other than to just say that we weren't there to observe it. Another thing, one other thing that I want to present to you about the debate is that Nye continued to ask Ham, give me something that I can predict. Is there something in your world model that will predict the future somehow? And Nye said that science has over and over again predicted certain things to happen in the future, and they did. Most recently, science predicted the existence of the Higgs boson particle, and supposedly they have found it. And so he gave evidence of times where science has been able to make a prediction based on the model, and the prediction came true. He also pointed out that they are willing to change their mind if they're given the right evidence. You know, for a long, long time, the model of the universe was that all matter started out in one point, and then it exploded in the Big Bang. And there was gravity, so that as matter flew out, gravity began to take over, and all the matter slowed down, and they guessed that at some point the matter would stop, and then it would collapse back in on itself. And then somehow it would explode again, is what they guessed, and then come back, kind of like breathing, I guess, and just over and over again, each time billions of years. But when they studied the evidence for what was really happening, they made a stunning discovery. Does anybody know what it is?
Still going out.
It's accelerating. It's totally counterintuitive. And this is an example of something that Ham kept saying, is that there are sometimes there's new evidence that will dramatically change what the scientific model is. Dramatically change it. And this is a pretty dramatic change. There's a lot of things that are still the same, but instead of the universe collapsing back in on itself, now the current model is that it will just continue to fly apart, and nobody's sure what that means. That's something that science is still working on. So Ham brought that up as well. But one of the things that was missing in this debate is the whole idea of intelligent design. And there wasn't enough talk about biology and evolutionary biology, because they got stuck on this matter of the age of the Earth. And a lot of their time was spent on that. In fact, a lot of Christians and Christian science, scientists, not Christians, science, but scientists who are Christians, gave Ham a hard time in their writing after this because he did spend so much time on the edge of the earth, and not on some of these other things which they see, and I would agree with them, as much more relevant to the debate between science and religion. But Ham did bring up he did at least bring it up. The audience had the opportunity to give questions. The questions were read, and each man had to answer the question. And this is where it really got interesting. As long as they were debating each other, they sort of stayed in their comfort zone. It was somewhat boring. But when they began to answer the questions, then it got interesting. Here was a question to Nye. How did the atoms that created the Big Bang get there? I love that question. That's a good question. There are two questions that are unanswered by science, and I don't think they'll ever be answered. And this is not the God of the gaps, but let's talk through this for a minute. The first one is, why is there something instead of nothing? And that sounds dumb at first, but it's really a profound question. It's the same question that the questioner was asking here. Where did all the matter come from that the universe is made out of? What do you think science has to say about that? Does anybody know?
It's always been there. I don't know.
Mr. Nye, how did the atoms that created the Big Bang get there? You know what his answer was?
Outer space.
What? Here's his answer. This is the great mystery. What was before the Big Bang? This is what we want to know. Let's keep looking. This is the great mystery. It is, well, it's not a mystery. To us, anyway, because we know that God spoke everything into existence. But the point was that they haven't even really in many ways started because they don't know why matter is here or where it came from. And it's troubling to the scientific community that there was a Big Bang. It's troubling. A lot of people, when they hear Big Bang now, Christians, they're like, oh no, I don't know about the Big Bang, that's science, I'm scared of it. But we really shouldn't be. Because the Big Bang refuted what science wanted to believe for a long time, which was what? Does anybody know? That matter is eternal. Einstein wanted desperately to believe that matter is eternal. Because if matter is eternal, then we don't need whom? We don't need God. It's just matter was always there, it will always be there, and that's all there is. Carl Sagan, and Bill Nye is a disciple of Carl Sagan. The universe is all there ever was, all there is, and all there will ever be. And so they wanted to believe that matter is eternal. And Einstein wanted to believe it so bad that in all of his computations, as his mind reached out through math to understand the universe, they all continued to lead him toward something that was unsettling for him. It was troubling. It was that the universe has a what? Think Genesis 1:1. In the beginning. Every time he looked at the universe with that brilliant intellect given to him by God, by the way, everything that he did kept leading him back to in the beginning. In the beginning. And it was so troubling to him that he made up something called the cosmological constant, which was a fudge. It was a made-up calculation that every time he would get close to being a beginning, he would put that part of the calculation in so that there wouldn't be a beginning. He was running from God. Then another scientist noticed the red shift in light that's all around the universe, and Einstein was finally convinced scientifically that the universe is expanding, and so there has to be a beginning, and he embraced the Big Bang. When a man like Einstein embraces the Big Bang, it really is tremendously significant because it's saying that we can no longer run away from this question of the beginning. We now have to answer the question. The God question cannot be avoided. Any of you have ever heard of Stephen Hawking? He's the guy that is in the wheelchair. He's gotten quite old now. He's been around for a long time. He too is a brilliant physicist and an atheist, a committed atheist. And he also is troubled by the notion that there might be a beginning in the universe. And so he has worked for years with his brilliant mind to try to come up with a way to avoid the universe having a beginning. He wants the universe, he wants matter to be eternal. If matter's eternal, we don't need God. If matter's not eternal, there has to be something that is, and that something is someone, and it's God. He understands that. So he has come up with something in his calculations called imaginary time. Imaginary time. This is a brilliant physicist. And he has come up with time, he said, regular time moves like this. Imaginary time moves like this at the same time. And somehow or another, that makes the universe infinite, so that he doesn't have to deal with the God question. The next question tonight, how did consciousness come from matter? Now we're getting into the area that I like. These are better questions. Age of the earth, it's interesting. We can argue about that, but there's far more fascinating things to talk about than whether the earth is 6,000 years old or 4.5 billion years old. What's far more interesting is, how did life get here? How did humanity get here? Why do we have a consciousness? Why do we have a mind that can even understand the world around us? So Nye has asked, how did consciousness come from matter? Anybody want to take a stab at how he answers? Don't know. I gotta respect the guy. He knows when to say he doesn't know. But he's saying, I don't know, there's some pretty big questions here. Where does matter come from? Where does consciousness come from? And he goes back to his excitement about nature. This is when he begins to say some kind of weird things. Listen to this. He says, no, this is a great mystery. The joy of discovery is what drives us. It's deep within us. I claim that I have spent time with dogs that have the joy of discovery. That's where I went, whoa, wait a minute, back that up. Did I hear that right? That's why it took me more than 2.5 hours to watch the debate. That's one of the sections I had to listen to a few times and say, Karen, come here, did I hear this right? I claim that I have spent time with dogs that have had the joy of discovery. We have one ancestor as far as we can figure. Researchers are looking for a second Genesis. NASA, your tax dollars at work, looking to see if life could start another way. Is there some form of life akin to science fiction that is crystal instead of membranous? Would be a fantastic discovery that would change the world. Did you know that your tax dollars are being spent by the millions, the hundreds of millions, to not just find the origin of life, but to discover whether or not there's some kind of Star Trek type of life out there? Did you know that you were supporting that? Anybody know that? We are. In fact, a lot of the space program now is about discovering the origins of life. If you read the articles, it's about discovering the origins of life. And why do they want to discover the origins of life?
To disprove, or say there is no God.
To debunk God. Now, if you're just out there searching for the origins of life, that's one thing. But if you read the articles and listen to the scientists, the prevailing notion is we're going to prove that life started somewhere automatically by itself, and finally we'll put this God question to bed once and for all. And we're spending a lot of money to help them debunk what we believe in. Little unsettling. This was for the very first time I saw. If you watch the debate, you can watch for it. Tell me what you think. This was the first sign that I saw that Nye was a little uncomfortable. His mouth got a little dry. He got a little nervous. He was being moved into areas where he knew he was in trouble. Where does matter come from? Where does consciousness come from? This question wasn't asked, but you should always remember it if you're thinking about this or talking about it. Tell me how the first self-replicating biological life form sprang into existence. Tell me how the first self-replicating biological life form sprang into existence. Every scientist on the face of the earth today who's honest will say 3 words. What are they?
I don't know.
We don't know. Is there a model on the board? No, there's not. In fact, they're so far away from it that one of the most brilliant living scientists today, Richard Dawkins, who is my favorite atheist, when he's asked that question, and he's published in his book God Delusion saying this, he believes that space aliens must have planted life on Earth. This is a man who knows evolution better than any living being, and he knows it well enough to know that there's a problem. And the problem is big enough that he's actually now saying there's no way that life started on Earth. It can't happen. Did you know that? Did you know that? There's no way that life could have started on Earth. It couldn't happen. Richard Dawkins, brilliant evolutionary atheist scientist. The only way it could have gotten here, according to Richard Dawkins, is that space aliens dropped it off. It's good stuff for movies. So space aliens or God? So you can see now why Nye is getting uncomfortable. He's being pulled. As long as he can talk about layers of ice, rings on the trees, radiometric dating, he's very comfortable, he's very good, he presents himself well. But when we start talking about evolution, especially the beginning of the process, and talking about where matter came from, he's getting uncomfortable. Question to Ham: would anything change your mind? This was interesting. Would anything ever change your mind? Ham took a long time to think about his answer here. And he finally said, I'm a Christian. And God has definitely shown me very clearly what I believe. And he admitted to starting with the Bible. This is where Ham mentioned prophecy. And I wish he could talk more about it. Because Nye asked for predictability. But he was asking for predictability in the natural world. It's one thing to predict the natural world. It's something else to predict human behavior. It's something else to predict the course of history. One thing that should never be lost upon us in all of these debates is that the most complex, the most fascinating, the most interesting thing that exists in all of the universe is what? What is it? You. You. Any single human being is far more complex and beyond our ability to even begin to understand than all the supernova and dark matter and everything else that's out there. And what was evident to me is that Nye was very comfortable talking about inanimate matter. He was very comfortable talking about how the physics of the universe work. But when we pull ourselves over into biology, he's still okay for a little while, but he begins to get uncomfortable. We talk about consciousness, the mind. We talk about the things that are unique to humanity, and suddenly he begins to squirm. The Copernican revolution. What happened there? Copernicus proved what? That the earth was not in the center of the world. You know, the Copernicus revolution and science began to realize that when they looked at the night sky that the sun wasn't going around the earth. What? The earth was going around the sun. And not only that, all the other planets were going around the sun. And not only that, it's even bigger than that. We're just on the tip of this one arm in this galaxy that's spinning around, and it's got a center. And not only that, there's all kinds of galaxies, and they have centers and spaces to them, and it gets incredibly complex. And suddenly people said, we're no longer in the center of the universe. The Bible seems to indicate that in Genesis chapter 1 that humanity is the crowning glory of all creation. Heaven and earth, stars, moons, sun, animals, plants, whatever it is, humanity is the top. Why? By the way, theologically, Genesis chapter 1 says that we're at the top because we're created what? In the image of God. That's not biology, by the way. It's theology. And so humanity was pushed off to the side by the Copernican revolution, and no longer were we in the center. And people would say things like, how can you believe that there's a God and that He's interested in us? We're so inconsequential. We're just like a grain of sand on the seashore. But an amazing thing has begun to happen. Nye knows it. That as we have studied the universe, there's something called the anthropic cosmological principle, which says that the universe is fine-tuned to support human life to a degree that goes beyond belief. I hope none of you are gamblers. But if you were a gambler and you worked the numbers out on this, it would have so many zeros on it that it would go around the room in here. To believe that the universe was put together with all the particular laws and the force of gravity and everything exactly the way that it is, to be tuned so closely and so finely to support life on Earth, to believe that that happened by accident is absolutely ludicrous. It's a leap of faith. Whoa, wait a minute. Scientists don't make leaps of faith, do they? The leap of faith by science is to say, someday we'll prove that that's true. Someday we'll prove that before the Big Bang there was no God. Someday we'll prove that somehow or another all of these proteins just came together all by themselves, and whack, suddenly there was a self-replicating biological life form, and from that point all the other life forms came about. Someday we'll prove that the consciousness of humanity is not unusual, that a chimp is going to have it someday. Someday we're going to prove all of that. Well, that's weird, isn't it? Because it kind of puts them in the same position that they've said that religionists were in all this time. Well, someday God is going to show up and you'll find out that He's there. Someday, on Judgment Day, you're going to stand before God and you'll have to admit that there He is. But there you go. Both sides have a someday, don't they? Both sides have a sort of a judgment day, if you will. Both sides are standing on what? Faith. Did you know that science required faith? Anybody?
A whole lot more than what it is today.
Well, I always feel like I'm cheating you if we don't fill in at least one sentence on our outline. So let me jump ahead here to the outline. You've got two outlines. You've got one on the back that's already filled in. And God willing, when we get back together again on Sunday nights in a week or 2 weeks at least, I want to remind you that we've been through a lot of this stuff already, and you have heard some of these things, and we've looked at some of them. So I just gave that to you already filled in. But I gave you 4 sentences that are related to this particular debate between Ham and Nye. I think it's important that we think our way through this. It'll be helpful. Let me give you at least one of the sentences. The first one, well, I'll give you 2 of them tonight. The first one is this: we should not force the Bible to say more than it does. We should not force the Bible to say more than it does. Well, I haven't finished talking about the age of the earth. So when we get back together, we'll come back and look at that again. What does the Bible really say about the age of the earth? What does it say? Why is Ham so convinced that the Bible requires the earth to only be 6,000 years old? He has his reasons, but we'll talk about it. And one thing we want to be very, very careful to do is not force the Bible to say something or more than it does. Let me just say this. Is there anywhere in the Bible where it says that the age of the earth is an article of faith? The answer is no. Jesus didn't say, if you want to follow me, take up your cross, deny yourself, take up your cross, and believe the earth is 6,000 years old. And Ham knows that, and he'll admit it. And Nye knows that too. He knows that there are a lot of scientists who are Christians who believe the earth is old. He knows that. When the Philippian jailer asked Paul, what must I do to be saved? Paul didn't say, believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and believe that the earth is 6,000 years old, and you'll be saved. In fact, the age of the earth has never been an issue in any creed or statement of faith historically throughout the history of Christianity. This debate kind of is pretty recent. So it's interesting. It's new. It's not really that old, maybe 100 years old or so. And in scientific and theological terms, that's a new debate, and it's working its way out. So one of the things that we want to be sure that we do is make sure that we don't force the Bible to say more than it does. We've got enough to talk about with people about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ and about their personal faith in Him than to get sidetracked onto issues that may not be as clear as some people would like to say that they are. Here, number two, atheists, like theists, are committed to a particular worldview. I want to show you the next time we get together how in this debate that Bill Nye, even though he tries to come across as an open-minded scientist, that he gives away the fact that he is committed to a particular worldview. And that I don't think you could change his mind about his worldview. It's not about evidence. It's about something that he's committed to, and then he's building up evidence for that. He knows that there are huge questions about what he believes in, big holes, and he's willing to say, I don't know, and I respect him for that. This is a big mystery. I respect him for saying that, but he needs to also be honest and say, that's a huge piece that's missing from the puzzle that you're putting together. A huge piece. Well, I need to stop. So we'll continue in a couple of weeks, God willing. Remember, next week at 6 o'clock during this time, we're going to be enjoying a concert by 10 Steps Back and Friends. So you'll want to be here for that. And of course, Easter morning is a great time of worship that we'll have together. But then in 2 weeks, we'll come back. If you have questions, now that you've kind of heard what we're doing, this isn't going to last long, maybe one more session. But if you've got questions about these issues, they'll come up from time to time, but we may not talk about some of them again for a while. If you've got something that's bothering you or that you would like for me to address or a question that you would like to know the answer to, please tell me. And I will put it into the teaching the next time because I know that some of this stuff can be disturbing, and my job is to build your faith. I want to build your faith. And if something's bugging you and you have a question, would you please come and tell me, and I'll do my best to help you out with that. Let's pray together. Father,